This is Force for Hire,
a deep dive into private military contracting and how it's transforming the battlefield.
I'm Michelle Harvin.
And I'm Desmond Ferris. Mad Mike Hoare lived life at full speed, best known for his time as a mercenary commander in the Congo and leading an attempted coup in the Seychelles.
He began his military career as a soldier in the British Army during World War II and rose through the ranks to lieutenant colonel. Afterward, he moved to South Africa as an accountant. But itching for adventure, it wasn't long before he was running safaris and eventually leading a mercenary force.
His son, Chris Hoare, wrote a book about his father's exploits called Mad Mike Hoare, The Legend. He's been interviewing his father throughout the years to get a greater sense of his past and thoughts on mercenaries.
Do you see mercenaries today having potential?
Yes, I do. More than ever. More than ever. Subject to it being properly run. A good example is this chap, I forget his name, who started a professional unit, a company I think. The press gave him a little positive coverage, and one or two of the Gold Coast residents had said, since that unit has been here, we've been able to sleep, the market has opened, etc., etc. That's exactly my attitude, that they can do it quicker than any regular unit.
In this episode, Chris will be telling the story of his father, the nuns and priests he rescued during the Congo crisis, how he got involved with the CIA, and a lot of other crazy stuff. And by the way, Mad Mike is proof that living fast is not always a trade-off for longevity. The legend celebrated a significant birthday just this year.
Yes, that's right. He turned 100 on St. Patrick's Day, 17th of March, and being Irish, of course, this is all very auspicious.
That's amazing. And although making it to 100, he lived dangerously. He was an adventurous soul. Can you just sort of paint a picture of your father for us?
When war broke out, Mike was drafted in immediately, and he always described it as the happiest day of his life. Soon, he was identified as somebody with potential, and I've seen his report, his war record. It says that he was a forceful and aggressive type who will go far. And then he joined a reconnaissance unit and went to India, working in armored vehicles, and then to Kohima, where he saw action. And really, it seems to me, if I can try and be impartial, that he was a brilliant soldier. He told me that his commanding officer had told him he was the best bloody soldier in the British Army. And, of course, by the end of the war, he was a major at the age of 26. And it must be said that the stories of the Boer War had attracted him. And then during the war, the ship he was on to go to India called at Cape Town. And they spent about 10 days or 2 weeks ashore in Cape Town. And Mike always described Cape Town in the same 3 words. He always said the girls were magnificent, regular blokes drove Cadillacs, and the sun never stopped shining. So there you had a number of factors drawing him to Africa. Well, I don't know if you believe in coincidences, but it all actually started in 1958 when Mike went looking for the lost city of the Kalahari. The Kalahari is a massive desert abutting South Africa. Of course, he didn't find it, but he found a business opportunity, and that was to run safaris the next year. And on that safari was an American who purported to be the vice consul at the consulate in Durban. In fact, he wasn't. He was CIA, and he and Mike became best friends and did adventures together. And then in 1961, when things went wrong in the Congo and the president of Katanga called for mercenary troops, John Rickard, the CIA man, egged Mike on and encouraged him to sign up. And, of course, jobs like that are not advertised in the newspapers. So it had to be an inside job, as it were, and that's how it happened. Well, the Congo was a Belgian colony and had been for about 60 years or more. And rather hurriedly, the Belgians gave the Congo independence. That happened on the 30th of June, 1960. There was immediate mayhem when the local people started a minor rebellion and taking it out on the whites, who they regarded as the source of all their problems, the whites being the Belgian settlers in the Congo. So at the beginning of the following year, February 1961, they called for mercenary troops. And that is when Mike got involved and found himself in charge of about 120 English-speaking mercenaries. The Katangan government wanted to use mercenaries to combat the United Nations and to hold off the Congolese army. Looking at it fresh from now, I think it's quite obvious that what happened there was very much a sideshow. Mike and his men didn't really achieve very much. Ultimately, they were expelled from the Congo in the middle of 1961. Well, after Katanga, Mike resumed his former life, which was leading safaris in Bechuanaland, which is now Botswana, for 2 years. And then he got the call, as it were. You know, he was needed. He had made a name for himself in Katanga in 61. Mike went back in 1964. By then, the situation had changed. The Prime Minister of the Congo, who was named Moise Tshombe, had gone into exile, and Katanga had been forcibly brought back into the fold, as it were. And by this time, a communist-inspired rebellion had ignited in the east of the country mainly, and was making its way almost unhindered towards Leopoldville, the capital. And so by the middle of 1964, they controlled about half the country, possibly more. And of course, the Americans and the Belgians and the West, in fact, were concerned that the Congo was going to fall to the communists. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, by way of background, the Cold War was at its height at this time, and the space race. And one might ask, why was America so keen that the Congo should not fall into communist hands? And the answer is one simple word, and that is cobalt. Cobalt is found mainly in only 2 places in the world, Russia and the Congo. So from America's point of view, if the Congo fell to the communists, they would have no cobalt. And of course, cobalt is used in missile systems, in rocket systems, weaponry, and other strategic equipment like that. So that they had to hold the Congo, and that's why they got involved. And in fact, the Americans, with some help from the Belgians, were the ones behind the employment of Mike and his 5 Commando in 1964. And Moise Tshombe, the former Prime Minister of Katanga, was now back in power as Prime Minister of the whole of the Congo. And so he was advised to bring Mike back. So it wasn't that easy, but Mike was employed, because what were they to do? What other options did the Congo have? You know, basically their house was burning down, and you have to do something. And so they employed mercenary soldiers, and that was Mike and his men. And Mike was always very sentimental, and being Irish and knowing about the wild geese from history, he decided to name his men the wild geese, which of course was quite a clever move. The wild geese were Irish soldiers going back in history now, I think at the end of the 1600s, who had been beaten by the British in a battle, and they decided that rather than fall under the British yoke, they would rather go and fight for European armies as paid soldiers, in fact, as mercenaries. And the interesting thing is that mainly the French and Belgian mercenaries who came to the Congo in 1961 were, as Mike said, unsoldierly louts. and gave mercenaries a bad name. And of course, the press dubbed them les affreux, the frightful ones. And Mike wanted to differentiate himself from these les affreux. So, although one doesn't think of mercenary soldiers as being gentlemanly, Mike was first and foremost a British Army officer. And he took those attitudes with him to the Congo. And for example, everybody who was there will tell you that Mike insisted that they should shave every day, whether they were in action or out of action. Their uniforms should be clean and neat. They should wear berets, plain green berets, no camouflage caps, no daggers, nothing fancy like that for Mike. And one of the guys told me that he even sent somebody back to South Africa for wearing the wrong color hat. And in fact, one of the men who was in the Congo said that Mike was an officer and a gentleman with a bit of pirate thrown in. And I rather like that description, because there was something of the pirate about Mike. Mike, for years, for even decades, didn't talk about the CIA. And if you look at his books, and he wrote 3 of them on the Congo, I think he doesn't even mention the CIA or being involved with the CIA. But the fact is that he was. I asked him specifically about this in our recorded interviews, and I asked him if he was on the payroll, and he said he wasn't. And I said, well, wouldn't you like to have been? And he said, no, he didn't like that kind of thing. What he liked was a big chunk of money every now and then, and that's what the Americans gave him. So, but, I think we should be clear. He was definitely linked to the CIA, and the amazing thing is that after 6 months in the Congo in 1964, Mike had enough. This was the Joseph Conrad's inner station. It was a horror show, and Mike couldn't take it. So when he got back to Durban at the end of 1964, he told the CIA that he'd had enough and he wasn't going to go back. And he told me that they said to him, you have to go back. And he said, well, I'm not. And they said, you have to. And he said, I'm not. So they said, name your price. And ultimately, he did go back.
When we come back, Mike and the Wild Geese take back the city of Stanleyville. Stay informed on all the news that matters most to the military community with a subscription to Stars and Stripes Digital Access. As a subscriber, you'll enjoy unlimited access to the Stripes.com website and our Stars and Stripes mobile apps, updated 24/7 by reporters stationed at military bases around the globe. Subscribe today and enter the promo code PODCAST when signing up for a yearly subscription and receive 50% off your first year. Get exclusive access to special features, interactive articles, award-winning photography, and more. Visit stripes.com/digital and enter the promo code podcast to subscribe today.
Many people referred to the rebels as savages, and certainly they did use savage techniques of torture. The traditional method of torture, if they caught one of the enemy, would be to tie his body to a tree and then to cut off the arms above the elbow and cut off the legs below the knees, and then shove a sharp stick up his rectum and leave the man to die. There were a lot of massacres of nuns and priests, horrendous massacres of nuns and priests, and the raping of nuns. Many of the nuns they rescued were pregnant. It was, there was cannibalism, and very little discipline. And of course, the ANC, the Congolese army, were equally guilty of committing atrocities when they were able to. What had happened was the rebels had taken Stanleyville, which was the second biggest city in the Congo, in August 1964, and in amongst the people they took hostage were all the staff of the American embassy, including some CIA personnel. So the first objective of the mercenaries was to take Stanleyville. And Mike and his men, who were also known as 5 Commando, didn't get the go-ahead to go until it was very late. So it was the paratroopers who got to Stanleyville first. They landed on the airfield, made their way into town. Meantime, there were several hundred, I think 300 hostages being held. And when their captors heard that the paratroopers were on their way, they herded the hostages into the city square, where at a certain point they opened fire on them, and unfortunately 28 were massacred, including the famous American missionary by the name of Carlson. And of course, this was world news. A couple of hours later, the wild geese came in by road from the south. There was still a lot of mopping up to do, and that happened over the next few days. But essentially, the rebels lost the city at that point. There were thousands of nuns and priests in the Congo, and after Stanleyville had fallen to the mercenaries, Mike's mercenaries, and the Belgian paratroopers towards the end of 1964, the government asked Mike to please go and rescue the nuns and priests all around the Stanleyville area, of which there were probably about 2,000. And of course, this wasn't part of his original brief, but he felt obliged to do this. There were nuns and priests from many European countries and also Congolese nuns and priests in mission stations. And unfortunately, Mike and his men were too late sometimes, and they would just find some clothes on the banks of the river, and they never found the nuns and priests. It was controversial because the mercenaries were white, and worse than that, many of them came from South Africa, which of course at that time had an apartheid policy, separateness between whites and blacks, and the world did not approve of that. And so it was doubly bad in a way. But the Congo had a problem. And in fairness, I've seen the documentation, and Shombi, the prime minister, appealed to 5 African countries for help, saying, look, we've got a big problem here, come and help us, and nobody came to help. So what was he supposed to do? So he did the only thing he knew how to do, and that was to employ mercenaries who happened to be white. After the Simba Rebellion was crushed, which was by the end of 1965, Mike had well and truly had enough, and he left the Congo. But the job had pretty much been done. The other, his unit continued in the Congo for about another year and a bit. But the main work had been done, and Mike more or less retired to Durban in South Africa and wrote a book about it. He was approached quite a number of times by people to come and assist them. And, for example, Nigeria, who were in a war by now with a breakaway province called Biafra. And so Mike visited both sides in 1967. He He was also approached to fight in Angola, Mozambique, and Cambodia, for that matter. Cambodia in 1970. And so after the Congo, he didn't, in the immediate time after the Congo, he didn't get involved in any mercenary work. And one day in 1977, he got a call from the producer to say, how would you like to be the military and technical advisor to a film about mercenaries in Africa? And oh, by the way, Richard Burton is going to play you. And of course, the amazing thing was that Richard Burton was one of the few heroes that Mike had in his life. Richard Burton, of course, was a famous Shakespearean actor. Mike loved Shakespeare, knew his Shakespeare, had memorized many lines from Shakespeare. And so now he was going to hopefully rub shoulders with Richard Burton. And he told me he did have some moments alone with Richard Burton where they discussed Shakespeare. The story I like best is when the script called for Burton to stand on a first floor balcony and to encourage his men who are on the ground floor. And Mike said, no, not like that. You've got to get right up close to your men, look them in the eye and encourage them. And apparently they did that. Pretty much at the same time as the film was being made, Mike was approached by some exiles. They called themselves the exiles from the Seychelles to help them to reinstate their man who they regarded as the rightful president. He had, after all, been ousted in a coup in 1977. And so he agreed because it would have meant replacing the wrongful government, which was a socialist government, Marxist inclined government, and replacing them with a pro-West government. So that was always Mike's interest. That's the thing he liked to do. And so he agreed to help them, even though they had hardly any money. Well, what happened was he did a number of reconnaissance trips to the Seychelles and ultimately decided that the job could be done with about $300,000, which, of course, in 1979 was worth a lot more than it is today. The South African government, in the form of the army, the South African Defence Force, agreed to provide the weapons. And one day a truck pulled up at Mike's house in KwaZulu-Natal and unloaded 75 AK-47s and 23,000 rounds of ammunition, and I forget how many rocket launchers and two-way radios and quite a lot of equipment, in fact. But essentially, $300,000 was not enough money, and their plans for getting the weapons to the islands kept on falling through. I think partly because of this problem of money, and ultimately the intelligence service of the South African government got involved and said, no, what you should do is take the weapons with you on a charter flight, and they should be hidden in the false bottom suitcases. And so that's what happened. And in fact, in fairness to Mike, 9 people went as an advance party in dribs and drabs from Durban to Johannesburg and then to Victoria, the capital of the Seychelles. And, those were the days before we had scanning, and everybody just sailed through. So when the 50 went with Mike on the airplane to the Seychelles, they were expecting to get through without any trouble, and it was just bad luck. Somehow they found a weapon, and then all hell broke loose. The mercenaries started shooting, and plus I've been told that the men had been drinking quite heavily on the plane, and so all in all, there was quite a lot against them, and they decided to retreat to the airport building and to try again at first light. And of course, as we all know, a Boeing 707 traveling from Harare in Zimbabwe to Bombay in India needed to refuel in the Seychelles, and so they came into land and asked to be refueled. And so Mike and his men were in charge of the airport at this time, so they refueled the plane. And of course, as we know, the men decided that they would be better off elsewhere, but they didn't like the idea of going to Bombay, so they went on the plane and asked to go to Durban. And of course, the court later found that it was a hijacking, and it does sound like it was. The court case didn't go well for the men, and ultimately Mike and all of the men were found guilty of various crimes, and Mike was sentenced to 10 years in jail. The senior guys got 5 years, and so on, to the rank and file who got 6 months. Of course, they weren't found guilty of trying to depose the Seychelles government. All the charges were relating to crimes to do with aviation. And of course, we were all agitating behind the scenes for him to be released. And I must say, a number of lawyers helped us. Nobody charged us anything. We did all sorts of things to try and get him out. But none of them appeared to work until one day this presidential amnesty was announced, and what it consisted of were 3 conditions. That to qualify for this amnesty, you had to be a first offender, over 65 years of age, and to have served a quarter of your sentence. And so we were delighted when we figured it out and we saw that Mike would qualify. And in fact, in the family, we thought, well, these terms were tailor-made for Mike, and the government at last had done something to help the man get out of prison, and the man, after all, who they were helping before the coup to oust an unfriendly government. So we felt it was only fair that he should get some kind of amnesty or pardon, and of course he did come out after 33 months in jail. Mike said in his book Congo Mercenary that he was proud to have led the wild geese and proud to have achieved what they achieved, and he dedicated his book to those who did not come back. So on the one hand, we have that, but it's my experience that ever since then, he was somewhat reticent about having done what he did. And for example, I used to say to him, why don't you go on a speaking tour of America? You'll earn decent money and you'll enjoy it. But he wouldn't, because it was always going to be about having been a mercenary. And, you know, as we all know, mercenary soldiering, there's something distasteful about it. Nobody really knows exactly what it is that's so distasteful, but it wasn't really approved of. And I think Mike just preferred to forget about the whole thing. I've been quite interested and even surprised to hear from so many people who have bought my book and read my book. And many of them say things like, thank you for placing it all on record. Of course, Mike has had detractors during his life, but the people who write to me all think he's a fantastic hero. And yes, the world authority on mercenaries in the Congo is on record as saying that Mike and his men changed history in the Congo. And yes, they kept the communists out. And then he goes on to say that seeing that the history of Five Commando was largely the story of Mike Hoare, this is the case of one man changing the course of history.
There's so much going on in this story that he's done.
Yeah, I guess he was just sort of all business and no nonsense. Like, this is just what has to happen.
The stuff this one man did revolutionized the way, say, mercenaries or private military contractors operated.
I mean, the last line of this is a case of one man changing the course of history, I think is pretty crazy to think about.
But I believe he's a legend. He did all this stuff, and at the end of it, just walked away like it was nothing. But it was everything. Thanks to Chris Hoare for sharing the story of his father. You can read his book, Mad Mike Hoare, The Legend, to learn more about Mike's adventures. We, of course, couldn't fit all of them into one episode, so check it out at madmikehoare.com. In the next episode, we'll be hearing the story of 3 contractors who were taken hostage in Iraq in 2016 and were held for an excruciating 31 days.
Always the first day, because you are in disbelief. Is this fucking happened to me? After 12 or 13 missions, this happened to me? I always thought I might get killed one day, but being taken hostage, that never crossed my mind.
Don't forget to subscribe. And while you're there, leave us a review. You can also let us know your thoughts at podcast@stripes.com. Also, follow us on Twitter for updates at Stars and Stripes.
Force for Hire's supervising editors are Bob Reed and Terry Leonard. Digital team lead and editor is Michael Darnell.
Thanks for listening.
This is Force for Hire.